That is the only statistic that matters when the smoke finally cleared over the gray, chopping waters of the Baltic Sea. There wasn't a single pulse left beating. We aren't talking about a merchant convoy caught in a bad storm. We are talking about 60 Swedish warships, the most terrifying military machine of the age, reduced to splintered driftwood and floating corpses in less than 60 minutes. The Vikings, the predators of Europe, the men who kicked down the doors of Paris and stared down the walls of Constantinople, did not die here fighting a mighty empire. They didn't die fighting a Christian king. They died screaming, drowning in their own blood, terrified of something they didn't understand until the water filled their lungs. History books have lied to you. They sold you a clean image of the invincible Viking, the wolf hunting the sheep. But on the eastern shores, in the deep, lightless forests of what we now call Estonia and Latvia, the wolves ran into bears. These were tribes that didn't just refuse to fear the Norsemen, they learned how to hunt them. But before we descend into this nightmare, do me a favor. If you want to see the history they don't teach in school, the dark, the visceral, and the real, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Join us in the shadows. Let's begin. To understand the sheer panic that gripped Scandinavia that morning, you have to understand the arrogance that came before it. For 3 centuries, the Baltic Sea was essentially a Swedish lake. The kings of Svealand looked east and saw only one thing: a warehouse of slaves and wax. Crossing the sea was easy. It was routine. It was just business. But they made the fatal mistake of every dying empire. They underestimated their victims' capacity to learn. No one saw the change coming. At first, it was subtle: a longship failing to return home, a Danish patrol vanishing into thin air near the island of Saaremaa, in Sigtuna, Sweden's glittering commercial capital. They shrugged it off. Bad weather, bad luck. The gods were angry. They didn't want to see the truth. They refused to admit that on the other side of the water, hidden in secret shipyards deep within the winding fjords of Kurland, the barbarians were engineering their own navy. And these weren't cheap knockoffs. These were lighter, flat-bottomed vessels, designed not for the open ocean, but to move like ghosts through shallow waters and rocky archipelagos, the exact terrain where heavy Swedish dragon ships ran aground. The blindness ended on a Tuesday in summer. The lookout in the fortress on Gotland didn't even sound the horn because his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. It wasn't the red and white striped sails of a noble enemy. It was a chaotic swarm, dark sails, hundreds of them, cutting the waves with a violence that paralyzed the garrison. The Battle of Gotland wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Baltic raiders didn't want an honorable duel. Honor is a luxury for men who think they are immortal. These men wanted to win. They used naval guerrilla tactics. They hooked onto the gunwales of the anchored Swedish ships. But they didn't board. Not yet. Instead, they hurled clay pots filled with venomous vipers and burning pitch onto the decks. Panic on a wooden ship is a special kind of hell. Fire at sea is the sailor's oldest nightmare. Men who had slaughtered Franks and Saxons without blinking were now jumping into the freezing water in full chainmail, choosing to drown rather than face the demons emerging from the smoke. But the real horror wasn't in dying. It was what happened if you lived. The Vikings feared a death without a sword in their hand because it cost them Valhalla. But they feared the Cronians more. Legends whispered of shrines deep in the Baltic forests where Norse prisoners weren't enslaved, but sacrificed. The priests of the forest didn't read books. They read the future in the entrails of Swedish warriors. That certainty, knowing your final destination wasn't a glorious hall, but a blood-stained stone in a dark thicket, shattered Viking morale faster than any weapon. In Sigtuna, news of the disaster arrived with the tide. Fishermen found the wreckage washing up on the beach, bodies beheaded, paled on ash spears in the sand. The message was crystal clear: the water doesn't belong to you anymore. King Knut Eriksson, locked in his fortress, faced a crisis that could end his reign. If he couldn't protect his own coast, his crown was worthless. Rival clans would smell blood in the water. He needed a victory, and he needed it yesterday. He needed to crush these eastern pirates to restore the natural order of things. So he made the decision that would seal the fate of thousands. Instead of fortifying his home, he ordered the total mobilization of the Royal Fleet, the gliding asterisk. He launched a full-scale offensive to the east. They were going to burn Kurland to the bedrock. They were going to teach them a lesson in pain. It was massive, 300 ships, 10,000 men, steel gleaming under the July sun as they sailed from the Stockholm archipelago. Priests blessed the sails. Wives waved from the docks. It looked like a triumphant march. It looked like the return of the glory days. But there was a problem. A tiny detail the king and his generals missed in their hubris. Spies. Sigtuna was an international city. Russians, Germans, Wends, and Balts walked its streets, selling furs and paying taxes. But among the merchants smiling at the city guards were eyes that watched everything. Men who memorized the number of ships, the volume of provisions, and most importantly, the exact date of departure, while the Swedish armada sailed east, looking for a fight in the open sea. A solitary, small, fast boat slipped out of Sigtuna. In the opposite direction, it hugged the coast, invisible against the rocks, carrying a message to the warlords of Kurland. The message was simple. The nest is empty. The she-wolf has left her cubs alone. The Swedish fleet sailed into a trap, but not the kind involving an ambush at sea. They expected resistance on the beaches. They expected a shield wall. What they found was nothing. The coastal villages were deserted. The livestock was gone. The wells were poisoned with carcasses. It was a ghost land. Confused and angry, the Swedish generals ordered a landing. They pushed into the dense forest to hunt the enemy. That was the exact moment the war was lost. While 10,000 Vikings marched heavily through the trees, chasing shadows and fighting mosquitoes 300 kilometers away across the sea. A massive fleet of black sails emerged from the morning fog off the Swedish coast. They weren't going to fight the army. They were going for the throat. They were going for Sigtuna, and the jewel of the Swedish crown was defended by old men and children. Dawn on Lake Mälaren was usually silent, a white mist floating over the water, but that morning, the mist was broken by the sound of 1,000 oars striking the water in unison. For the people of Sigtuna, the stone city, the heart of commerce and religion, hell didn't wait for the sun to rise. It arrived with the first light, the wooden barriers protecting the harbor, designed to stop deep-draft Viking longships, were useless. The shallow Baltic ships slid over the submerged logs like snakes crossing a fallen branch. There was no negotiation, no demand for surrender, only fire. The city guard ran to the walls. What they saw froze their blood. It wasn't a disciplined army forming lines. It was a tidal wave. Warriors disembarked while the ships were still moving, leaping into the surf. They didn't wear heavy mail that slowed you down. They wore hardened leather and carried short axes. They were fast, brutally fast. In less than 15 minutes, the main gate was burning. Meanwhile, 400 kilometers east, King Knut began to sense that something was terribly wrong. His army had been marching in circles for days. Local guides they had captured and tortured led them into swamps where horses broke their legs, and armored men sank waist-deep in black mud. Every night, sentries vanished. No scream, just gone. The psychological warfare was dismantling the discipline of the most powerful force in the north. Where are their cities? The captains argued. Where is the gold? The answer was the silence of the forest. The Curonians weren't defending territory. They were defending time. Every day the Swedes spent in the mud was a day Sigtuna burned. Unprotected. Back in the city, the massacre had reached the cathedral. Archbishop Johannes, the holiest man in Sweden, took refuge at the main altar, surrounded by sobbing women and children. They believed the stone walls would save them. They believed even barbarians would fear the wrath of the Christian God. They were wrong. The invaders didn't come just for silver. They came to send a political message. They battered down the cathedral's massive oak doors with improvised rams. The sound of splintering wood echoed like gunshot in the nave. When the invaders poured in, they didn't stop at the cross. The archbishop was decapitated right there on the altar steps, his blood soaked into the sacred vestments. In an act of supreme humiliation, they didn't just loot the treasury. They dismantled the magnificent bronze city gates, masterpieces of Swedish craftsmanship, and loaded them onto their ships. They didn't just take the wealth, They took Sweden's pride. The smoke from Sigtuna was so dense it darkened the sun on farms 20 kilometers away. Survivors who fled into the woods looked back and watched their world collapse. The asterisk Pax Suecia asterisk the peace imposed by Viking power was over. The hunters had become the prey. Across the sea, King Knut finally gave the order to retreat. Hunger and terrain had defeated his army without a single pitched battle. Back to the ships, he spat. We will return next summer and burn this cursed forest. But when the Swedish vanguard reached the beach, the king's heart stopped. The ships were there, but 50 of them were blazing torches. A fast raiding force had waited for the army to leave the beach before torching the rearguard. The guards lay dead with black arrows in their throats. Chaos seized the beach, and then they saw it. Not a rescue ship, a small Swedish fishing boat with torn sails, driven by terror across the sea. A messenger collapsed at the king's feet, his face smeared with soot. Knut grabbed him by the tunic. Speak, the archbishop is dead. The city is gone. They have taken the gates. The silence that followed was heavier than any shield. 10,000 warriors lowered their eyes. They hadn't been beaten by superior strength. They had been outsmarted. They left the door open, and the wolf walked in. But the humiliation wasn't over. The journey back was a gauntlet. The Baltic is cruel. It's a maze of islands and sandbanks. For an expert navigator, it's a highway. For a demoralized fleet, with tired captains, it's a graveyard. The Cronians and Oslians knew the Swedes were coming back desperate. They didn't want a battle. They wanted to ensure Sweden stayed down for a generation. They attacked in the fog near Gotland. They didn't ram. They used fire ships. Small, agile boats buzzed the heavy transports, hurling pots of boiling fat. A ship without sails is a floating coffin. King Knut watched from his flagship, powerless. If he stopped to help the burning ships, the whole fleet would be surrounded. He had to make the coldest decision of his life. Sail on. He left his own men to burn or drown. The screams faded into the fog behind him when they finally limped into Sigtuna Bay days later. There were no cheers. The smell hit them first. Wet, ash and death. The king disembarked onto a gray beach. He walked to the ruins of the cathedral. Where the bronze doors once stood, there was only a gaping black maw. He dropped his helmet in the dust. The metal rang out in the dead square. He knew this wasn't the end. The tribes had tasted blood. They realized that united, they were unstoppable. But victory is a dangerous drug. The tribes got greedy. They didn't settle for dominating the sea. They looked south, toward a different enemy, an enemy that didn't fight for gold or land, but for something far more dangerous. While Sweden licked its wounds, a new monster was waking up in Germany. The Pope was not interested in tribal skirmishes. He declared a crusade, not to Jerusalem, but to the north. The last pagans. The spearhead wasn't farmers with pitchforks. It was the Livonian brothers of the sword, warrior monks, terminators of the 13th century. They arrived at the mouth of the Daugava River to stay. When tribal scouts saw the German ships, they laughed. Floating tombs, they called them, heavy, slow, loaded with stone. The locals tried their usual tactics: ambush and retreat. But when they attacked the first settlement, Riga, they hit a wall. Literally, the Germans didn't build wood palisades that rot. They built stone castles. Stone was alien technology to the forest tribes. Arrows bounced off the masonry, and from the top of those walls came death with mechanical precision. The crossbow. A Viking bow takes years to master. A crossbow allows a peasant to punch a hole through a warrior's chest from 100 paces. With the pull of a lever, the tribes died in droves without ever touching their enemy. But the real terror came in the open field. Bishop Albert of Riga unleashed the heavy cavalry. Imagine the scene: light, fast tribal warriors in furs facing a line of steel statues, knights on massive war horses, covered in chainmail. It wasn't a fight, it was physics, mass times velocity. When the charge hit, the ground shook. The knights didn't break the tribal line, they pulverized it. It was a harvest. The myth of Baltic invincibility, forged in the fires of Sigtuna, was shattered by the iron of Germany. But humans adapt. In the depths of the Lithuanian forests, The chiefs held a war council. They realized the old ways were dead. To survive the Iron Crusade, they had to evolve. They had to stop being tribes and become an empire. They needed to take the war to a place where the heavy horses couldn't go. The ice winter. 1236, the Grand Master of the Order, a man named Volkwin, made the classic mistake of relying on technology over terrain. He looked at the map and saw the frozen swamps as highways. He marched his massive column of knights deep into Samojisha. They didn't know they were being herded. Lithuanian scouts on skis moved silently through the trees. They waited until the column reached the Sol Pass, a deceptive clearing over a bog. The trap snapped shut at dusk. Volkwin ordered the charge. Crush them, God wills it. 500 knights spurred their mounts, and then the ice gave way. Not fully, but enough. The heavy hooves punched through the crust into the freezing sludge below. The momentum died instantly. Horses panicked, breaking legs. Knights fell, rolling like turtles in steel shells, unable to stand in the deep snow. The light infantry swarmed them. They didn't fight fair. They used hooks to drag the knights into the black water and held them down until the bubbles stopped. Grandmaster Volkwin fought like a demon, but a peasant with a sickle hamstring him from behind. The massacre at Sol wiped out the Sword Brothers in a single afternoon. This victory changed everything. One man, Mindaugas, watched the slaughter and realized the truth. If we remain separate, they will hunt us down. If we are a fist, we are untouchable. He began a brutal unification, join or die. He forged the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But the West wasn't done. The Pope merged the broken Sword Brothers with the Teutonic Order, a superpower of monastic violence. And they turned their eyes to Russia, to Novgorod, to a prince named Alexander Nevsky. 1242, the battle on the ice. The Teutonic Knights, arrogant as ever, marched across Lake Peipus. They formed the Boar's Snout, a steel wedge designed to crack any infantry line. Alexander Nevsky knew he couldn't stop them on dry land, so he invited them onto the lake. He put his weakest troops in the center as bait. The Germans took it. They smashed into the center, thinking they had won, but they were surrounded. Nevsky's elite cavalry hit the flanks, and then the lake had enough. The sound of breaking ice isn't a crack, it's a groan, a deep, belly-rumbling moan from the abyss. The weight of thousands of armored men and horses concentrated on one spot was too much for the April ice. It wasn't a heroic death. It was a chaotic scramble of clawing hands and black water. Heavy armor drags you down like an anchor, the flower of German chivalry drowned in the freezing dark. But the final nail in the coffin came years later. At the Battle of Durban, the Teutonic Knights tried to use conquered Curonians as cannon fodder. In the heat of battle, the Curonians turned around. They looked at the masters who enslaved them, and they switched sides. They attacked the knights from the rear. It was the greatest backstab in medieval history. That day, the Iron Wall fell. Mindaugas, the king who had briefly converted to Christianity to buy time, tore the cross from his neck. The experiment is over, he said. Lithuania would remain pagan. From the ashes of these wars rose the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a pagan empire that would stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a state that would stop the Mongols and hold off the Crusaders for 200 years. The story started with a Viking fleet thinking they were hunting sheep. It ended with the birth of a superpower. The lesson the North learned that century was written in blood. You can burn a village, you can tear down a wall, but if you corner a bear in its own cave, you don't get to walk out. If this story made you look at the map of Europe a little differently, hit that like button and tell me in the comments which forgotten war should we dig up next. Because history is written by the victors, but the truth is usually buried with the dead. I'll see you in the next one.